Welcome, welcome, welcome. Hurricane Hub Live here on this Tuesday, June the 24th. And folks, we got a bit of a surprise. Andrea has formed. Our first named storm of 2025 is out there swirling in the North Atlantic, not bothering anybody, but taking a name off our list here in the 2025 Atlantic hurricane season. Now that we're just over 3 weeks into the season from June 1st to November 30th. All right, let's get right into things. So Andrea has formed. Now, the big question is, what's next? Is this going to kick off a flurry of activity out in the Atlantic basin? Well, I'll tell you what, probably not. You can see the basin overall looks pretty benign. Nothing going on out there aside from Andrea, which, looking at it, can you tell where it is? It's not a very dominant feature on the satellite imagery. We've got to go all the way to the north. There it is right there. That's what's left of Andrea. We talked about this yesterday, it being a very lackluster type of system, and it's well away from any land. Here's Bermuda right here, and it's several hundred miles off to the north and east there. And here's a look at visible satellite imagery. You see the sun coming on up, rising in the east and moving to the west. And you can see the overall spin there. Getting a close-up look here going through the daylight hours today. In the first couple frames, you can see the low-level circulation completely exposed. And we had talked about this yesterday, that it was running into an area of higher wind shear. And as evidenced here on satellite imagery, we've got the wind shear that's coming in from the southwest. And that is effectively dislocating all the convection or thunderstorm activity to the north and east. And you could see the flare up here of some convection earlier on, which is what likely enabled the Hurricane Center to say, you know what, let's go ahead and upgrade this to a tropical storm, giving it the first name of the season. And then you can see now it's just an exposed circulation, low-level circulation, not even any convection associated with it anymore, as it's moving rapidly off to the north and east, moving at 20 miles per hour, pretty good clip, but hanging on just barely to tropical storm status. You need 39 miles per hour or greater. We have that right now. Gusts satellite estimated up to around 50 miles per hour. So a lot of times you'll hear us refer to systems like this as fish storms. I don't really like to do that because when they're out in the middle of the Atlantic, yeah, they're not affecting anybody over land, but of course you have marine and shipping interests here, so there will be some minimal impacts overall. So it's not just a fish type of storm. All right, switching things up here on water vapor imagery. And basically what this is, it's a satellite filter that depicts the amount of moisture in the mid-levels of the atmosphere, depicts them with a certain color bank. So the bank we're looking at here is the yellows and even some rust colors here up and over land, dry air in the mid-levels, and then the blues and some shades of white is going to be higher moisture content levels in the mid-levels of the atmosphere. Why I like to show this is because when we have a tropical system, we would like to look for moist mid-levels of the atmosphere. That's conducive for tropical development. Notice here, here's the spin of what's left of Andrea. It is pulling in plenty of dry air all into its circulation. A lot of times that'll help to choke it off. So overall conditions for this to even become a named storm were very, very marginal. And the window of opportunity for that to occur has pretty much passed. It was declared a tropical storm at 11 a.m. this morning from the National Hurricane Center. They initialized the advisories on it. And it looks to become a remnant low here in the short term. I mean, look at how far out the cone goes. It only goes out to 2 a.m. Wednesday morning. So they'll likely only issue one more advisory tonight at 11 p.m. and that probably will be a downgrade to a remnant low, and then it will just kind of go off into the distance, fade into the sunset farther to the north and east, and eventually head towards the Azores. So you can see here in the far right-hand side of your screen there, still not going to be any very impactful at all. So first named storm of the season, right? We had visited this yesterday in terms of the climatology of a hurricane season based off the last 30 seasons. Typically, first named storm comes on or around June 20th. Today's the 24th, not too far off from that. And then you jump ahead almost a month till you get the second named storm, July the 17th, August the 3rd. And then notice the gaps get smaller as you get deeper into the season, right? Because development becomes a lot more likely as you head into August and certainly September. Why? Well, you get to the peak of the season, right? Around September the 10th. Environmental conditions overall are most conducive for tropical development by that point in time. So the gaps get smaller and smaller as you get deeper into the season. Now, I will say, we looked at this yesterday as well, past 10 hurricane seasons, the date of the first named storm Last year, it happened just 5 days earlier on June the 19th. In the last 2023, it was June 1st. And we had a couple years that it was in May. And even a couple years like 2020, it was May 17th. And then had a year that it was April 20th, 2017. And of course, your eye gets drawn to this one, the anomaly. 2016, January the 12th. That was Hurricane Alex. Yeah, hurricane in January. Doesn't happen often, and it hasn't happened since. And then 2015 was May 8th. So, it being the June 24th today, this was the latest first named storm since 2014. Okay, just a year before 2015 here. And that storm, as we talked about also yesterday, was Arthur. That happened that formed on July the 1st and made landfall in the Outer Banks of North Carolina July 3rd, I think it was. It was 4th of July weekend. It was a Cat 2 hurricane at landfall in the Outer Banks. So even though it's early in the season, you could still get a hurricane. And a case in point, which we'll visit here in a second, will be Beryl from last year, developed just a couple days from now, a year ago. And of course, that was a Category 5, earliest Category 5 on record in the Atlantic Basin. Here's another look overall. Not much going on, not even that much in the way of cloud development here. Why do you think that is? Look at the amount of Saharan dust. And this is exactly that. It is dust that gets kicked up from thunderstorms in a part of in the northern region of Sahara Desert, and it gets lofted north and carried west. And this is not unusual. This is exactly what we expect early on in the season. This has been happening for weeks now. And typically this starts to break down a bit or even shift a little farther to the north as we get deeper into the season. The dust never completely goes away. It does become a little bit more isolated, a little bit less intense, and shifts to the north, allowing convection of fire here in the main development region. Almost opens it for business for development later in the season as that lifts off to the north. So here's the Saharan dust outlook. So we've got several plumes coming here off the coast of Africa, transiting the entire Atlantic, moving through the Caribbean, Gulf, and even making it into the southern portions of the United States. Earlier this season, we did have a few plumes that did haze up the sky a little bit. That paired with Canadian wildfire smoke made for some pretty poor air quality in parts of the east and southeastern parts of the U.S. But expect several more weeks of dust to be a limiting factor in development out in the Atlantic Basin. So how does Saharan dust originate? Well, it comes from the Saharan Desert, but something has to loft it into the air, right? It doesn't just magically rise and then float off to the west. Well, you've got monsoonal thunderstorms that develop in an area just south of the Saharan Desert called the Sahel. And once this happens, these storms build up, they collapse, the outflow boundary moves up and over the desert, and it kicks that dust into the air. So much so that it rises so far that it gets picked up by trade winds aloft that carries it due west in the higher levels of the atmosphere. It runs into high pressure over the Atlantic that carries it further. And that pretty much pushes it all the way to portions of the United States, into the Caribbean, covers most of the big development areas of the Atlantic Basin. And that's what's happening exactly right now. So we can update our hurricane season scorecard. We've got one of the books here in the Atlantic now, Andrea, low-level tropical storm, as you saw. And then it just adds to the list of the Eastern Pacific that just wrapped up with Eric. May have Flossie, may have number 6 on deck here. We'll show you the latest development odds on that. But Eric was a Cat 4 as it made landfall on the Pacific coast right over here, just near Acapulco, last week. Still pretty active out in the basin here. We've got another area that they have actually tagged as Invest 95E. Now, if you were watching yesterday, I broke down what an invest means. So invest is short for investigative area. That being 95, it rotates through from 90 to 99, so it's just for record-keeping purposes. And then E on the end tells us it's a basin indicator that it's in the Eastern Pacific. If we were talking about the Atlantic, which we were with Andrea yesterday, that was Invest 90L. So the L depicts it's out in the Atlantic Basin. So this is Invest 95E. Latest update from the Hurricane Center still keeps it at high odds. No change from yesterday when we spoke. Still at 70% in the next 7 days. Large development area potentially here. We're still very warm sea surface temperatures. Plenty of conducive environmental conditions here. But again, the window in the East Pac is usually quite short because they always build off to the northwest. And eventually they encounter higher latitudes and colder water temperatures, so that limits their area of impact pretty much. But we did have Eric that made landfall here, and this one, depending on where it goes, could skirt that if it does develop. And of course, it would get the name, the F name, which would be Flossie here going forward. And here's the list of names for the Eastern Pacific season. It's actually different from the Atlantic Basin, 2 separate lists, but we went through the first 5, and then Flossie would be up next, and then Gill. And of course, it's 21 names, and there are additional names if needed. So when the East Pack is active, like we've seen, we usually get the Atlantic that's dead quiet. That's exactly what we've seen this year, and there's a reason why. It's usually a rule of thumb. It's because when you get development in the Eastern Pacific, the exhaust from these storms, the outflow aloft, leads to increased wind shear off towards the east in the Atlantic Basin. So increasing wind shear is an increase in wind speed and direction with height that is detrimental to developing tropical systems as it tilts them. They are vertically development heat engines. They need to be standing straight up. They need to have good posture. That way they can ventilate properly and develop. When you get the wind shear, they're forced to tilt over, and they just cannot develop properly. So that increases the wind shear, and that's what we've seen on top of the Saharan dust. Now, one thing that's not a problem and has not been a problem for a long time now is a lack of warm water in the oceans. This is current sea surface temperatures, and obviously just looking at the color bank, you can tell that it is very, very warm. We need like 78, 79, 80-degree water temperatures to facilitate the latent heat transfer from the surface of the ocean to developing storms. We pretty much have that everywhere. We'll start in the Gulf of Mexico, where you can see there is a nice little plume here of very warm waters that are already in the upper 80s. Do you remember last year there was actually an area of warm waters off the southwest coast of Florida that got over 100 degrees? Shallow waters, but still. And that, of course, leads to the bleaching of the coral reefs and just not good. So we're already in the 80s here, plenty of warm water, deep warm water as well. That continues into the Caribbean, certainly sufficient for tropical development in the entirety of the Caribbean Sea. And then we visit the Atlantic, the main development region here. There's the Cabo Verde Islands. We're pretty much to the southwest of there, stretching all the way to the leeward, windward islands from the coast of Africa, and water temperatures here, even though they're a little cooler, are still sufficient for tropical development. Let's talk a little bit more about what the main development region actually is. And it's just basically a block, a rectangular area that, as we get later in the season, it usually opens for business late July, right through the prime of the season, mid to late September it goes through, and it produces long-track tropical systems, hurricanes. And most of our most impactful storms have been developed in the MDR. But sometimes we get storms that come out of here outside of this development window, before July or after September. And here's a look at just a couple of the past. Right down here, right below our little streaming box there is Beryl. That was last year. Beryl, as I mentioned, was the first Category 5 system, the earliest Category 5 storm in the Atlantic Basin to develop. And that's where it started 4 days from now, on June the 28th. And then it eventually ended up making landfall in the Houston area. I think it was like high-end Cat 1 when it made landfall. So thankfully, it wasn't a Cat 5, which is what it peaked at. And then the year prior, Brett was a 2023 developer, and that one was way out here, too. And then Elsa in 2021. And then we have to go back to 2017 before we have Brett. So they can produce June storms in the main development region if overall conditions are there. At these points in times when these developed, obviously the Saharan dust wasn't too much of an issue. Although Beryl was pretty far to the south, the dust was likely to the north here. In fact, I do remember that. It was to the north, so it actually wasn't even impacted, and it was a low-riding storm as it lifted to the northwest eventually and moved into the Caribbean Sea and really blossomed. In fact, here's the storm track on it. You can see the color coordination here of when it was really intensifying. This is when it became a Category 5 as it entered the western portions of the eastern portions of the Caribbean Sea. Maintained major hurricane status for a while, moved over the Cayman Islands near Jamaica, passed over Cancun and the Yucatan Peninsula, and then made it into the Gulf, and still was a hurricane as it made landfall. It was the earliest forming Category 5 in the Atlantic on record. And I remember when that one formed, we were like, oh boy, it's only June. We've got a major hurricane out in the Atlantic already. Is this a sign of things to come? And then we went for a while. Most of the rest of the July was very, very quiet. And everybody was, of course, throwing in the towel. Oh, storms, the season's over. And then, like we've seen the last couple of seasons, they're backloaded. And of course, last year was a very active season. Helene, Milton, major hurricane landfalls in the United States, unfortunately, again. So we'll see what happens this go around this year. But here's a look at our storm names. So we've already got Andrea on the list. That's crossed off. We've got 20 names that remain. Hurricane Center's calling for between 16 and 19 named storms this year, which is categorized as an above normal season. It would just be the latest in a long line of years that we've had a lot of activity in the basin. So we'll see if we get through any of these names. If for some reason we run out, hopefully not. 21 names are here. If we need more, there's an auxiliary list. That's no longer the Greek alphabet. It's just another list of names that doesn't change. This one rotates out every 6 years. So we have 6 lists. But this is the list this year. Barry's up next, and then Chantal, Dexter, and Aaron. All right, that's the latest on today's Hurricane Hub Live, folks. Not a ton to talk about. We just touched on Andrea. By the time we talk about it tomorrow, it'll be gone. It'll be a remnant low and probably won't be able to find it on satellite imagery. So we'll have more to talk about in other regards of tropical weather and to check on the Eastern Pacific as well. But in the meantime, you can find me on all the social media platforms, Facebook, Instagram, X, and TikTok. We'll see you again tomorrow night.